30 miles of gravel through southern Colorado, blind curves, 2 hand-cut tunnels, cliffs with no guardrail dropping hundreds of feet into the canyon below. Every year, thousands of people drive Phantom Canyon Road, believing they're passing through one of Colorado's most haunted places. Some say a railroad was abandoned here because the canyon was cursed. Others claim ghostly figures still walk the old grade after dark. Almost none of that is true. Phantom Canyon Road was never abandoned. Something beneath it was. On the night of July 21, 1912, a violent cloudburst unleashed a wall of water through this canyon. By sunrise, 12 railroad bridges were gone. 5 miles of track had been ripped apart or buried beneath rock, mud, and fallen timber. Yet this wasn't the first time the railroad had faced disaster. 17 years earlier, another flood had destroyed large sections of the very same line. Back then, the company rebuilt everything, and trains returned within months. This time, they never came back. The road you're driving today follows the exact path those trains once climbed toward the richest gold district in Colorado. Every curve, every grade, and every tunnel was designed for steam locomotives, not modern vehicles. So what changed? Why survive one catastrophic flood but surrender after the next? By the end of this video, you'll know why the railroad really disappeared, how one train crew barely escaped a deadly flood, and why the ghost story everyone remembers has distracted people from the real reason Phantom Canyon Road exists today. To understand why the railroad disappeared, you first have to understand why anyone built it through a canyon this unforgiving. In 1891, prospectors struck gold near the tiny settlement of Cripple Creek. What began as a remote mining camp exploded into one of the richest gold districts in the United States. Within only a few years, thousands of miners, merchants, and investors poured into the mountains. Every mine needed machinery, lumber, food, fuel, and workers. Every ounce of gold needed a way back out. Whoever reached Cripple Creek first would control an economic prize worth millions. There was one problem. The shortest route climbed directly through Phantom Canyon. On January 1, 1894, construction began on the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad. From the first weeks, the canyon fought back. Flash floods repeatedly washed away fresh construction before the first locomotive ever arrived. Crews rebuilt damaged sections, blasted through nearly solid rock, and carved 2 narrow tunnels that drivers still pass through today.
Against enormous odds, they finished the entire railroad in just 6 months. On July 1, 1894, the first train rolled into Cripple Creek, greeted by cheering crowds who believed the impossible had been accomplished. For a brief moment, it looked as though human engineering had conquered one of Colorado's harshest canyons. But Phantom Canyon wasn't finished testing the railroad. Only 1 year later, it would prove who was really in control. The railroad's victory lasted barely a year. On the night of July 30, 1895, a violent cloudburst broke over the mountains above 8 Mile Creek. Rainwater gathered into a roaring torrent that raced through Phantom Canyon, carrying trees, boulders, and entire sections of the mountainside with it. Witnesses estimated the flood surged down the canyon at nearly 30 miles an hour. When it was over, almost 10 miles of railroad had disappeared. Bridges collapsed into the creek, track hung twisted in midair or vanished beneath mud and rock. Telegraph lines were ripped away, cutting off communication with the outside world. But the railroad wasn't the flood's only victim. The Great Elk Hotel at Adelaide sat directly in the flood's path. Hotel owner Lee Tracy drowned. His cook, Mrs. Carr, also lost her life. A boarder named Mr. Watson was killed, along with 3 railroad section workers responsible for maintaining the line. 6 people died in a place that most visitors today know only as a scenic backroad. Oddly, this disaster is almost forgotten. Most modern retellings skip 1895 entirely and jump straight to the flood of 1912. That's a mistake, because the most important part of this story isn't what the flood destroyed.
It's what happened afterward. Despite losing people, bridges, and miles of track, the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad rebuilt everything. Within months, trains were climbing through Phantom Canyon again. which raises the question that ultimately explains this entire road. Why rebuild after one catastrophic flood, but never rebuild after the next? The answer didn't begin with the second flood. It began with success. When the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad opened in 1894, it controlled the fastest route between Florence and Colorado's booming gold mines. Every shipment of supplies, machinery, passengers, and ore flowing through Phantom Canyon meant money for the railroad. But monopolies rarely last. Within only a few years, competing railroads reached the Cripple Creek district using standard gauge track. Their trains carried larger loads, connected more easily with other rail systems, and often moved freight more efficiently than the narrow gauge railroad winding through Phantom Canyon. Mine owners suddenly had choices. Freight that once had no option but to travel through this canyon began moving elsewhere. Passenger traffic declined. Revenue shrank. Year after year, the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad earned less while still facing the enormous cost of maintaining a line through one of Colorado's most flood-prone canyons. The danger hadn't changed. The company's ability to pay for that danger had. By the early 1900s, the railroad had been absorbed into a larger company, and rebuilding after another major disaster would no longer be an easy decision. Every damaged bridge, every washed-out section of track, every repair now had to compete with simple business math. The canyon was still dangerous. The railroad was becoming weaker. Neither problem alone was enough to destroy the line. Together, they created the conditions that would make the next flood impossible to survive. Long before the flood that ended the railroad, Phantom Canyon came within minutes of taking even more lives. It happened during the flood of 1895.
Earlier that evening, a landslide had derailed a part of a 14-car train just above Adelaide. The train couldn't move, and 4 railroad men walked down to the nearby Great Elk Hotel to report the accident while crews worked to clear the line. No one knew something far worse was already racing towards them. Then, someone looked upstream. A wall of water. Witnesses described it as nearly 20 feet high, carrying trees, rocks, and everything else the canyon had ripped loose. It wasn't creeping through the valley, it was charging straight towards Adelaide. At almost that same moment, a helper locomotive farther up the line spotted the flood closing in behind it. Engineer Mathew Lines and fireman Bert Kreis immediately understood what was happening. They shoveled coal into the firebox as fast as they could and pushed the locomotive to its limit, racing downhill with the flood almost on their heels. For miles, it was a contest between steam and water. The locomotive finally pulled far enough ahead as the tracks curved away from 8 Mile Creek, escaping the flood's path. Lines and Kreis survived. The people waiting at the Great Elk Hotel did not. The railroad was rebuilt after that disaster, but the flood left behind something even more dangerous than a destroyed track. It proved that Phantom Canyon would always have the final say over anyone who entered it. 17 years later, the canyon came back for a second time. Late on the night of July 21, 1912, another powerful cloudburst burst over the mountains above 8 Mile Creek. Water poured into the narrow canyon, quickly building into a torrent even larger than the one that had devastated the railroad in 1895. By morning, the destruction was overwhelming. 12 railroad bridges had vanished. 5 miles of track had been ripped apart, buried beneath debris, or washed completely away. Entire sections of the railroad simply no longer existed. At first glance, it looked like history was repeating itself. But one thing had changed since the first flood: the railroad itself.
Back in 1895, rebuilding had been expensive, but the booming gold district still made the investment worthwhile. By 1912, years of competition had drained the company's profits, and the mining boom that once justified every repair was beginning to fade. This time, rebuilding wasn't just difficult, it no longer made financial sense. The owners looked at the shattered railroad, calculated what it would cost to rebuild another time, and chose to walk away.
That decision, not the flood alone, is why Phantom Canyon Road exists today. The railroad survived one catastrophe because it could still afford to fight. It lost the second because it couldn't. The rails were eventually removed, the locomotives sold, and the abandoned railroad grade remained, waiting for a new purpose. The mystery of why the railroad disappeared had finally been solved, but the ghost stories were only beginning. With the railroad gone, the facts slowly gave way to folklore. Today, ask almost anyone about Phantom Canyon Road, and you'll probably hear a ghost story before you hear its history. The most famous tells of a man in a prison uniform walking beside the old railroad grade at night. According to the legend, passengers recognized him as a prisoner who had recently been executed at the Colorado State Penitentiary in nearby Canyon City. The story has appeared in books, websites, and countless online videos, often repeated as though it were established fact. The evidence tells a different story. No contemporary railroad report documents passengers seeing the figure. No newspaper from the period confirms the sightings. Even the timeline raises serious questions. Colorado abolished the death penalty in 1897 and did not restore it until 1901, leaving a 4-year period when no legal executions took place anywhere in the state. Yet many versions of the legend place the ghost somewhere within that same decade without ever explaining how. That doesn't mean people never believed they saw something. It means belief isn't the same as evidence. The real tragedy of Phantom Canyon never needed a ghost to make it memorable. The canyon claimed lives through flash floods, railroad accidents, and the unforgiving landscape itself. Those events were documented. They left names, dates, and records behind. The legend survived because it's easier to remember a ghost than a business decision. But the truth is far more interesting than the myth. So what happened after the railroad disappeared? For a few years, almost nothing. The rails were gone, the locomotives had been sold, and the grade that once carried trains through Phantom Canyon sat quiet. What had been one of Colorado's busiest mining railroads became little more than a scar carved into the canyon wall. Then people realized something. The railroad might have been gone, but its path was still one of the only ways through the canyon. Exactly when automobiles first began using the old grade is still debated. Some historical sources suggest local drivers were already traveling parts of it by the late 19-teens. A formal architectural history, however, credits a major Depression-era project in 1938 with transforming the abandoned railroad grade into the mountain road recognized today. Either way, the canyon hadn't changed. Look closely as you drive today, and the railroad is still everywhere. The sweeping curves follow the original track alignment. The two narrow tunnels are the same ones blasted through solid rock in 1894. Stone retaining walls built for steam locomotives still support sections of the roadway. You aren't simply driving through history, you're driving directly on top of it. Today, Phantom Canyon Road is no longer a railroad, but the canyon that defeated it hasn't changed. The road remains unpaved for most of its 30-mile length. In many places, it's only 1 lane wide, with blind corners that force oncoming traffic to slow almost to a stop. There are steep drop-offs with little or no guardrail, loose gravel that reduces traction, and long stretches where there is no cell service if something goes wrong. Vehicles over 25 feet are prohibited for a simple reason. There isn't enough room to safely pass through some sections of the canyon.
The greatest danger, however, is the same one that haunted the railroad more than a century ago: water. Heavy rain can still trigger flash floods, rockfalls, and washouts with little warning. The force that destroyed bridges in 1895 and ended the railroad in 1912 is still part of this landscape today. The canyon hasn't forgotten what it can do. So here's the real answer to the question we started with. Phantom Canyon Road wasn't abandoned because of ghosts. It wasn't abandoned because of a curse. It wasn't abandoned because people were afraid to travel through it. The railroad beneath this road survived one catastrophic flood. It couldn't survive a second after years of financial decline made rebuilding impossible. Remember what I told you at the beginning? Phantom Canyon Road was never abandoned. The railroad beneath it was. More than a century later, the tracks are gone, the locomotives are gone, even most of the stations have disappeared. But every curve, every tunnel, and every climb still follows the path railroad engineers carved through this canyon in 1894. People came looking for ghosts. The real story was always beneath their tires. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more forgotten roads whose real histories are far more fascinating than the legends surrounding them.